The jungle was quiet that afternoon, but not peaceful. Thick layers of trees blocked most of the sunlight, turning the ground below into a maze of shadows and damp earth. The air in the New Guinea mountains was heavy, warm, and filled with the distant sounds of insects and dripping water. Every step through the mud felt like walking through history itself. A small Allied patrol moved slowly along a narrow jungle trail. For the soldiers of Easy Company, this was just another mission in a long series of frustrating searches. For nearly 4 months, Allied intelligence had insisted that somewhere deep inside these mountains there was a hidden Japanese supply base. But nobody had ever found it. Not the reconnaissance planes flying above the jungle canopy. Not the local informants who knew the land better than any map. And not the 23 patrols that had already searched these mountains. Every patrol returned with the same report. Nothing. Just endless jungle. Captain Richard Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead as he looked ahead at the trail disappearing into the dense green wall of vegetation. He had personally led 9 of the failed searches himself. Each time they thought they were close, each time the jungle swallowed the evidence. The enemy seemed to vanish into the land itself. Behind him, 5 soldiers followed silently, their boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. No one expected this patrol to be different from the others. Most of them were already thinking about the long walk back to base camp. But one man suddenly stopped. Sergeant James Whitehorse slowly crouched down in the middle of the trail. The other soldiers exchanged confused looks. To them, the ground looked completely ordinary, just another patch of mud left behind by the morning rain. But Whitehorse didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Carefully, almost gently, he placed 2 fingers near a shallow mark in the mud. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a small depression in the wet earth, a footprint, or maybe just a hole where rainwater had fallen. But the Apache tracker kept staring at it. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The jungle around them seemed to grow quieter as the soldiers waited for him to speak. Private Tommy Chen leaned closer and whispered to another soldier, "Does he see something?" No one answered. Finally, Captain Morrison stepped forward. "What is it, Sergeant?" Whitehorse didn't look up immediately. Instead, he studied the mark one more time, scanning the surrounding ground the way a reader scans a page of text. Because to him, that is exactly what the earth was, a page, and every mark on it told a story. When he finally stood up, there was a strange expression on his face, part certainty, part quiet disbelief. He looked at Morrison. "Someone walked here." The captain frowned. "That's not exactly surprising." Whitehorse shook his head slowly. "No, sir." He pointed down at the footprint again. "What's surprising," he paused, "is how they walked." The soldiers gathered closer. Whitehorse knelt again and traced the outline of the footprint with his finger. "When a person walks normally," he said quietly, "their heel hits the ground first." He pressed his finger into the back of the print. "That part should be the deepest." The soldiers nodded. It made sense. But then Whitehorse moved his finger to the front of the footprint. Instead of the heel, the deepest impression was at the toes. The captain's eyes narrowed. Whitehorse looked up again. "Whoever made this print," his voice was calm, but the meaning behind his words sent a chill through the group, "was walking backward." The jungle suddenly didn't feel so empty anymore. Captain Morrison looked down the muddy trail stretching deeper into the mountains. If someone had walked backward, that meant one thing. Someone had been trying to hide where they were going. And if that was true, then somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the mist, beyond the endless green jungle, something was waiting to be found. The soldiers stood silently around the strange footprint in the mud. For a moment, no one spoke. The humid jungle air pressed heavily against their skin, and somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out before the forest fell quiet again. Captain Morrison crossed his arms and looked down at the ground. "So you're saying someone walked backward?" he asked. Sergeant James Whitehorse nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." The captain studied the print again, trying to see what the Apache tracker had noticed. To him, it still looked like nothing more than a distorted mark left by a boot in wet mud. But Whitehorse saw something else entirely. To him, the earth was not just dirt and stones. It was a language, and he had been learning how to read it since childhood. Whitehorse had grown up on the Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona, where the desert stretched for miles in every direction. As a boy, he had spent long days riding across open land with his grandfather, a quiet man who believed that every mark on the earth carried meaning. Most people saw only ground. His grandfather saw stories. A bent blade of grass meant something had passed that way. A displaced pebble revealed the direction of travel. Even the smallest change in soil texture could tell who had been there, how fast they were moving, and how long ago they had passed. People think tracking is about footprints, his grandfather once told him. It isn't. It's about everything else. Whitehorse had carried those lessons with him into the war, and now, standing in the middle of a muddy jungle trail thousands of miles from home, those lessons were whispering something important. He knelt again beside the footprint. "Look here," he said quietly. The soldiers gathered closer. Whitehorse pointed to the deepest part of the print. "When someone walks normally, their heel hits first," he explained. "The weight pushes down here." He pressed a finger into the back of the footprint. "But this one is different." He moved his hand forward. The deepest part of the mark was near the toes. Captain Morrison leaned closer. "What does that mean?" Whitehorse stood up slowly. "It means whoever made this print wasn't walking forward." He pointed down the trail. "They were walking backward." Private Chen frowned. "Why would anyone do that?" Whitehorse looked down the jungle path stretching deeper into the mountains. "To hide where they came from." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. For months, Allied patrols had searched these mountains for signs of a hidden Japanese supply base. But every trail they followed seemed to lead nowhere. Every clue vanished. Every path ended in jungle. What if the enemy had not simply hidden their base? What if they had hidden the direction to it? Whitehorse began walking slowly along the trail, his eyes scanning the ground with intense concentration. At first, the soldiers saw nothing. Then he stopped again. Another footprint. And another. Each one looked ordinary at first glance, but when he examined them carefully, the pattern was the same. Toe pressure, not heel. Someone had walked backward along this trail for at least 30 yards. Captain Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was no accident. No one could walk backward that far without a reason. And whoever had done it had been careful, very careful. The footprints were spaced evenly, placed deliberately, almost as if someone had practiced the movement. Private Chen stared at the ground. "That means they wanted us to think the trail goes the other way." Whitehorse nodded. "Exactly." He turned and looked toward the mountains rising above the jungle canopy. "If someone is trying this hard to hide their tracks," he paused for a moment, "then whatever they're hiding must be important." A faint breeze moved through the leaves above them. The jungle shifted and creaked softly, as if it were alive. Captain Morrison suddenly realized something that made the back of his neck prickle. For 4 months, Allied patrols had been searching the mountains, but they had always followed the obvious direction of travel. If the tracks had been reversed, then every patrol might have been walking the wrong way. The captain looked at Whitehorse. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "which direction were they really going?" Whitehorse slowly turned and pointed deeper into the jungle, toward the mountains, and toward whatever secret had been hidden there all along. The deeper the patrol moved into the jungle, the quieter the world seemed to become. At first, it was only a feeling. Something about the forest no longer felt natural. The trail they were following was narrow, twisting between thick walls of vegetation. Massive tree roots pushed up through the soil like ancient bones, and tangled vines hung low enough to brush against their shoulders. But Sergeant Whitehorse kept walking, slowly, carefully. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Captain Morrison followed a few steps behind, watching the Apache tracker with growing curiosity. The man moved differently from the rest of them. Where the soldiers saw only mud, leaves, and broken branches, Whitehorse saw patterns, stories written in the earth. After several minutes, he stopped again, not at a footprint this time, at a plant. He crouched down and gently lifted a small branch. Private Chen leaned forward, confused. "What is it?" Whitehorse didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the leaves closely. Then he stood and looked around. Something wasn't right. To the untrained eye, the jungle looked wild and untouched. Plants grew everywhere in chaotic layers, vines wrapped around tree trunks, and fallen leaves covered the ground in thick brown carpets. But Whitehorse saw something different. Order. Subtle, but unmistakable. Several plants along the edge of the trail had been trimmed. Not recently, not obviously, but deliberately. Just enough so the branches didn't block the path. Captain Morrison frowned. "You think someone cleared this trail?" Whitehorse shook his head. "No." He pointed at the surrounding vegetation. "They didn't clear it. They made it look like they didn't." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Whitehorse stepped off the trail and walked a few feet into the jungle, then motioned for the others to follow. "Look here." At first, the ground looked exactly the same as everywhere else. But when Morrison looked closer, he noticed something strange. The plants here were thicker, denser, untouched. The trail they had been following wasn't just a natural gap in the vegetation. Someone had been maintaining it, carefully, patiently, for a long time. Whitehorse stepped back onto the path and continued walking. The patrol followed in silence now. The jungle around them seemed different, more watchful. After another 20 yards, Whitehorse raised his hand suddenly. Everyone stopped. He pointed at the ground again. Another sign. This time it wasn't a footprint. It was a stone. A small rock sitting near the edge of the trail. Private Chen frowned. "It's just a rock." Whitehorse shook his head slowly. "No." He crouched and turned it slightly with his fingers. The underside of the stone was darker than the surrounding soil. Wet. Recently moved. Whitehorse stood up again. "Someone placed this here." Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed. "To mark the trail?" "Maybe." Whitehorse looked down the path, stretching deeper into the jungle. "But not for us." A cold realization spread through the group. Every sign they had found so far pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had built this trail, not just to travel through the jungle, but to hide movement inside it. The deeper they went, the more signs appeared. A vine cut cleanly near its base. A fallen branch placed across the path in a way that looked natural, but wasn't. Small stones positioned at certain bends in the trail. Each detail was subtle, almost invisible, but together they formed a pattern, a system. Captain Morrison wiped sweat from his brow and glanced toward the mountains rising above the jungle canopy. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "how long do you think this trail has been here?" Whitehorse studied the ground again, then the trees, then the direction the path was leading. "A while." The captain waited. "How long?" Whitehorse paused before answering. "Long enough," he looked deeper into the jungle ahead, "for someone to believe no one would ever notice it." The wind rustled softly through the leaves above them. Somewhere, far away, thunder rolled across the mountains. Captain Morrison felt a strange tension building in his chest. For months, the jungle had hidden its secrets, but now it felt as if the forest itself was slowly giving them away. He looked down the narrow path again. The trail twisted deeper into the green darkness ahead, and for the first time since the patrol had started, it no longer looked like a random jungle path. It looked like a road that led somewhere important, and someone had tried very hard to make sure no one would ever follow it. The jungle had begun to change. At first the soldiers couldn't explain how. The trail still wound through the same towering trees and tangled vines, and the thick canopy above still blocked most of the sunlight. The air was just as humid and heavy as before, but something about the forest no longer felt empty. Sergeant Whitehorse sensed it immediately. The deeper they moved into the mountains, the more signs appeared. Tiny details that most people would never notice. A vine that had been cut weeks ago. A fallen branch that had been moved slightly off the trail. Leaves that had been disturbed and then carefully scattered again. None of these signs were obvious. That was the point. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort to make everything look natural. Captain Morrison stepped carefully over a thick root crossing the trail and looked around. "How close do you think we are?" he asked quietly. Whitehorse didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the surrounding ground once more. Then he pointed deeper into the jungle. "Closer than they want us to be." The soldiers continued moving forward, now slower than ever. Every step felt dangerous. If someone had built such an elaborate system of hidden trails and false tracks, there was a good chance they had also prepared defenses. The jungle around them grew steeper as the path climbed into the lower slopes of the mountains. And then, something unexpected happened. Private O'Brien, walking near the front of the patrol, suddenly stumbled. His boot struck something half buried beneath the mud. He nearly fell. "What the?" He crouched down and began pulling at the object. Within seconds, the muddy shape emerged from the ground. A wooden crate. The soldiers gathered around. Whitehorse wiped away the wet dirt covering the surface. Faded markings slowly appeared through the mud. Japanese characters. Captain Morrison felt a sudden surge of excitement. "Ammo crate," O'Brien said quietly. Whitehorse nodded. The wood had aged from months of rain, but the crate was still mostly intact. Someone had buried it here deliberately. But the location made no sense. The crate sat far away from any logical supply route. Too far from the coast. Too far from any known Japanese positions. Captain Morrison frowned. Why would they leave ammunition here? Whitehorse looked down the trail again. They didn't leave it. He paused. They wanted someone to find it. The captain stared at him. "You think this is a decoy?" Whitehorse nodded slowly. "If someone finds this crate, they'll think the enemy moved east." He pointed in the opposite direction. "But the real movement would be west." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. This meant the Japanese had not only hidden their supply lines, they had built an entire system designed to mislead anyone searching for them. Whitehorse stood up and continued forward. The patrol followed. The forest grew quieter with every step. Then suddenly, the ground beneath Sergeant Drake collapsed. There was a sharp crack of breaking branches. Drake vanished from sight. His scream echoed through the jungle. "Trap!" The soldiers rushed forward. Drake had fallen into a concealed pit nearly 8 feet deep. At the bottom, sharpened bamboo stakes pointed upward like spears. Miraculously, he had fallen between 2 of them. Blood ran down his leg where one of the spikes had torn through his uniform. But he was alive. Barely. The soldiers quickly pulled him out while their rifles scanned the surrounding jungle. Everyone expected gunfire, an ambush, but nothing happened. The forest remained silent. Whitehorse stepped carefully toward the pit and examined it. He studied the bamboo stakes, the edges, the dirt walls. Then he looked up. "This trap is old," he said. Captain Morrison frowned. "How old?" Whitehorse touched one of the bamboo spikes. "Months." The captain looked around nervously. "If it's old, why hasn't anyone maintained it?" Whitehorse stood slowly. "That's the strange part." He looked deeper into the jungle ahead. If the enemy was still using this area for defense, he gestured toward the trap. They would have repaired it. The captain understood immediately. That meant something else, something far more unsettling. If the defenses had been abandoned, then the enemy no longer expected anyone to come this far. The soldiers stood silently in the humid jungle air. The trail ahead twisted deeper into the mountains. Captain Morrison suddenly realized something. For 4 months, Allied patrols had searched these jungles, but none of them had ever come this far. None had followed the hidden trail. None had noticed the reversed footprints. Whitehorse stared toward the mountains rising above the jungle. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "They're close." The captain looked at him. "How do you know?" Whitehorse pointed toward the ground. The jungle floor had begun to change again. The soil was disturbed, more frequently now. More signs, more movement. And somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the endless green jungle, something large was waiting. Something that had been carefully hidden from the world for months. And the patrol was walking straight toward it. By the time night fell over the mountains, the patrol knew one thing for certain. They were close. The jungle around them had grown strangely quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The thick canopy above blocked most of the moonlight, leaving only pale silver streaks filtering through the leaves. Captain Morrison ordered the patrol to stop. They made a small, concealed camp between several massive trees, careful to keep their lights covered and their voices low. No fires, no unnecessary movement. If the enemy was nearby, even the smallest mistake could reveal their position. Sergeant Whitehorse sat near the edge of the clearing, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was listening. The jungle spoke in subtle ways, the sound of insects, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds. When something disturbed that natural rhythm, it meant something had changed. After a long moment he stood. "There," he whispered. Captain Morrison turned. "What is it?" Whitehorse pointed toward a rocky slope about 200 yards away. At first Morrison saw nothing, just another jungle-covered hillside. But then, something moved. Not an animal, not a person. The hillside itself. Corporal Sullivan raised his binoculars slowly. For several seconds he watched in silence. Then he lowered them again, his face pale. "Captain." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "The hill just opened." The patrol crawled closer through the undergrowth, keeping low beneath the dense vegetation. From their new position they could see it clearly. A section of the hillside had shifted outward. What looked like solid earth covered in plants was actually a massive door. Hidden perfectly within the jungle, the opening revealed a dark tunnel carved into the mountain, large enough for trucks. The soldiers stared in disbelief. For 4 months, Allied patrols had searched these mountains. Recon planes had flown over the jungle canopy again and again, and yet this enormous entrance had remained completely invisible. 2 Japanese soldiers stepped out of the tunnel. They stretched their arms and looked around casually, as if nothing in the world could possibly threaten them. Which, until now, had been true. Captain Morrison slowly lowered his binoculars. "Unbelievable," he murmured. Whitehorse studied the hillside carefully. More details were becoming visible now. Small ventilation pipes hidden among rocks. Camouflage structures blending perfectly into the vegetation. This wasn't just a bunker. It was an entire underground facility. The patrol watched silently as several more soldiers moved in and out of the tunnel entrance. No alarms, no signs of concern. The Japanese soldiers had no idea that anyone had discovered their hidden base. Captain Morrison felt a surge of adrenaline. All the failed patrols, all the weeks of searching, all the frustration. And the answer had been hidden beneath their feet the entire time. Whitehorse continued scanning the hillside. Then he spoke quietly. "This place is big." "How can you tell?" Morrison asked. Whitehorse pointed towards several different points along the slope. "Air vents." Thin columns of warm air shimmered faintly above the rocks. "Too many for a small bunker." Morrison realized what that meant. If there were multiple ventilation shafts, the underground structure must extend deep inside the mountain, perhaps hundreds of feet. An entire supply depot could be hidden down there. Weapons, food, medical supplies, enough to support an entire army unit. The captain looked back toward his patrol. For a moment, no one spoke. They all understood the significance of what they had just found. This base had been supplying Japanese forces throughout the region for months. hidden so perfectly that even reconnaissance aircraft had never detected it. And yet, it had been discovered because of something incredibly small: a single footprint. Whitehorse knelt quietly beside the jungle trail again. The same trail they had followed all day. The hidden road that had led them here. He ran his hand lightly across the ground. The earth had told its story. All someone had needed to do was listen. Captain Morrison looked toward the concealed tunnel entrance once more. 4 months, he said quietly. They fooled everyone for 4 months. Whitehorse stood beside him. But not the ground, he replied. The captain nodded slowly. Somewhere inside the mountain, dozens of Japanese soldiers continued their routine, completely unaware that their greatest secret had just been uncovered. The jungle had protected them for months. But now the silence of the forest carried a new meaning, because the secret hidden beneath the mountains of New Guinea had finally been found.